through a problem today. It's a problem I've been attempting to wrestle with for a very long time, and in one way or another, whether we know it or not, we're all wrestling with it. And it's the problem of perception. 5 decades ago, I suppose, the problem made itself explicitly manifest at a deeper level than it ever had before, although philosophers had wrestled with this problem for a very long period of time. And part of the problem was, how much do we bring to the act of perception and imagination and thought, and how much is revealed to us by what we perceive? Vinogradova, who are very well-known names in the Russian neuropsychological literature, which is a very academically impressive literature. They were students of Luria. I think both Vinogradova and Sokolov were students of Luria, who was perhaps the greatest neuropsychologist of the last mid-part of the 20th century. They were convinced to some degree that we built internal models of the world and then compared what was going on in the world to those models. Sokolov discovered a phenomenon called the orienting reflex, which was an electrophysiological response to error detection, or a response to novelty. That's another way of thinking about it. And he should have won a Nobel Prize for that, because discovering the instinctual basis of the response to novelty, that's no small thing. There's a lot of novelty in the world. And Sokolov really mapped that, in some sense, mapped that onto the body and onto the nervous system in a way that superseded what philosophers had done before that, because it made it much more concrete and tied it down to the underlying neural architecture. So, for example, if you're walking down the road and there's a loud noise behind you, and the noise is of indeterminate meaning, so perhaps a car has jumped a curb, that's a possibility. You'll go like that and stop and turn and orient towards the place in the space-time continuum where your stereo vision has localized the noise. And you do that really without thinking. I would say it's an act that occurs outside the domain of free will. And the reason you do that is because you might die if something unexpected happens, right? Something that's outside your framework of expectation. Now, you know your framework of expectation. You're an ignorant creature. You don't know everything. You don't even know that much. And your representation of the world is actually rather shallow and low resolution. It's good enough to get you where you want to go most of the time. But sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it's error-ridden enough, given the circumstances of time and place, that the error will kill you. And so you're equipped with instinctual mechanisms that orient you towards the source of the revelation of your ignorance. And that's something very interesting to contemplate, I would say, physiologically and neurophysiologically, but also philosophically, and I would also say to some degree theologically, right? That you have an instinct that orients you to the source of your ignorance. And you better have an instinct like that, because there may be a shortage of knowledge, but there's no shortage of ignorance. And that's, part of the problem of the relationship between the finite and the infinite, right? I mean, we're finite creatures. We can't know everything. We can't even know as much as we need to know. And that means, in some sense, we have to be able to deal with the fact that we don't know enough. And one of what Sokolov outlined, at least in part, was the underlying neurophysiological mechanisms that made this orienting reflex possible. One way you can measure it, for example, is if you put a gadget, a galvanometer, on someone's finger, and you play them a sequence of tones. When you play them the first tone, they'll show quite a response, and then the second tone lesser, and after that lesser, until finally it'll flatline. And people thought about that as habituation, but the more sophisticated cognitive scientists regarded it as the building of an internal model of the stimulus in all its varieties of parameters. Interesting word, stimulus. We'll return to that. And then if you play someone a different tone after habituating them to that sequence, the electrophysiological response will reinstantiate itself. Or even if you alter the spacing between the tones, the same thing will happen. And that's all part of this response to novelty and then the mapping of novel territory. This is unbelievably important, this discovery, because you don't learn anything except by encountering it as novelty first. So it's fundamentally the initial processes of everything you do to learn everything there is to learn everywhere all the time. And so, like I said, he should have won a Nobel Prize, but people really didn't understand the fundamental significance of this discovery. And a very influential line of English, British neuropsychology emerged out of that, because a gentleman named Geoffrey Gray, who was the most outstanding student, I would say, of Hans Eysenck, who was the most cited psychologist, research psychologist in the world for pretty much the last half of the 20th century. Geoffrey Gray wrote an incredibly brilliant book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, where he integrated the work the Russians had done, which very few people knew about, apart from Gray, who read absolutely everything. The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, I think, cited 1,300 scientific, deep scientific papers, neurophysiological papers, animal behavioral papers, like hardcore psychology, because there is such a thing. And he actually read all those papers, and he actually understood them. And then he integrated that with Norbert Weiner's, who was one of the fathers of cybernetics and computer science. He integrated that with Norbert Weiner's cybernetic theory and with, well, a raft of animal experimental material, and laid out the neurological basis for the establishment of the orienting reflex and also for the establishment of memory itself. It's a tour de force, that book. Was written in 1982, and psychologists have really only begun to digest the material in that book. So I read it when I was, well, back in about 1982, very soon. That was 85, I guess. Very soon after it was published. It took me like 6 months to read it because, well, I had to learn animal physiology and neuropsychopharmacology and animal behavioral science and cybernetic theory, and just along the way to understand what he was talking about. You know, it's a profound work of philosophy, I would say, and it's probably a necessary work of modern philosophy because we're starting to understand the underlying physiological substructure of many of the processes that have been discussed in the philosophical realm for forever.